So Peter, welcome. On behalf of all of us, let's give Peter a round of applause and bring him into the room.
So thank you, Paul, thank you. So let me just share some thoughts and then we'll figure out what you want to talk about. First of all, if John and I talk about community, you all are living it. If I wanted to know what community looks like, all I would do is watch what you do in the course of the day. And so really the meaning of this gathering is to deal with the pioneering nature of who you are. So that's one thought. So all of us depend on you to do what you're doing, and it doesn't matter who pays you. I know community building is an unpaid. There are very few people in the world full-time to do community building. So it's an uncredentialed or untitled part of everybody's job. So when Paul says community is an organizing principle, what has society treated it that way? Well, what are the organizing principles today that substitute for community? And so partly the question is, if you ask me what's the organizing principle of the culture I live, it's the economy. It's money. The reason community building doesn't get value is because it's not monetized. And Al will talk about it. Edgar Kahn talks about the core economy. And so what is dominant in the narrative today is a market economy. What's dominant in the market economy narrative is a consumer market economy. So 70% of the economy in the United States is based on consumer consumption. And so the President of the United States after 9/11 had one recommendation besides going to war, and that was to go shopping. And the consumer assumptions have a set of beliefs that have everything to do with what we're here about. One is the belief that whatever you have is not enough. So from the moment of birth, I am bombarded with messages, no matter what I have is not enough. People wonder, why do millionaires want more millions? Because they're living under the consumer assumption, no matter how much you have is not enough. And if the belief is that what you have is not enough, then the conclusion is that you're not enough. And so we're all works in progress. We are taught at an early age. In the first grade in the US, the normal distribution is placed on my head like a Napoleonic hat. And I go from a learner to a performer. And a good friend of ours, Ward Maillard, says that when you turn a child from a learner to a performer, you've stolen their humanity. And so thought one about consumer market, monetized, organizing principle is to let it sink in that we live in a belief system based on scarcity. What you have is not enough, and who you are is not enough, which makes you easy to control. If I can convince you there's something wrong with you, and convince in the same sentence that I can fix that, then I own you. I have colonized you. I have become Pharaoh. That's how I run the empire, is with your belief that what you have is not enough. The second thought that John's been so clear about is that whatever you need can be purchased. So the consumer monetized market, fair market, empire, Pharaoh economy tells you that you can buy whatever you need. You say, why has the arm of community withered? It's because we decided we can buy what we used to use with each other, what we used to exchange with each other. So if I want to raise a child, I expect the school to do that. I outsource to the school the raising of my children. Care for the elderly, I've warehoused all the people that are problematic. I was telling Paul that Walter Brueggemann is a friend of John and mine and yours, even if you don't know it. He said he's willing to die for Christ. He just doesn't want it to be inconvenient. What's sold in the purchasing process is convenience. Raise a child, care for the elderly. So that means that the service economy is a catchword for this. What it means, and in our terms is that the neighborhood and citizens have lost their capacity to produce. So if we care about the poor, the people on the margin, the people returning from prison, if we care about the elderly, the issue won't be solved if we think that they need more services, that they need more care. The issue really is how to help them be productive, useful, monetized or not. When you talk about community building, if you ask me what's at the heart of it, it's the reconstruction of an economy away from the idea of scarcity, away from the idea of purchasing, away from the idea of services, away from the idea that a rising tide lifts, away from the idea there's such a thing as generational poverty. I don't believe that. I don't believe that a human being's destiny is forecasted and predicted by their parents. And so that becomes what's in place. So most of my thinking is, say, well, what would an alternative economics look like? Monetized, unmonetized. So you might say community building is help every citizen. And so John's questions of what do you love to do? What are you passionate about? What are your gifts? What do you want to teach others? It's people with their productive capacity. It doesn't confront them with their needs and deficiencies. And one reason community building is in the state that it is because basically you can't raise $1 on gifts. You can't raise money. You need deficiencies. And that's what John has been so brilliant about. The essence of the careless society is just that. We decided to purchase what we could have produced. So that's a core idea. So if you say, what's the job community has to do? Well, it's to do these core things. It's to reclaim for the neighborhood the capacity to raise a child. When I was growing up, I had the afternoons to discover my freedom. I had the afternoon to learn it's possible to entertain myself. I had the afternoon to make mistakes, to get into fights and get it. Now, childcare is a managed event. I'm going to visit my grandchildren tonight, and most of what my daughter will talk about is her administration of a child care management bureau. Because all she does is, where are these children? What do they need to learn, and how are they doing, and how are they performing? So this becomes the work of community, is to raise a child by knowing its name, by having it be around people that are productive. Of course I want them to do well in school, but I don't want to brand them by their schooling. I shouldn't have to go through life carrying the burden of I dropped out of school in the 8th grade. So the school reform movement isn't going to change anything. It'll just make it better managed. So community, to me, is a perspective, is an alternative to the business perspective. The business perspective says speed, cost, scale, predictability are what matter. So what I have you coming together in this week for is to support each other in the reckless adventure of living outside the business perspective, creating a communal perspective, a perspective that says that depth matters much more than speed, that intimacy matters much more than efficiency. So that's the big shift in context. So so those are some thoughts. Other things the community can do is when John talks about its relevance to democracy. To me, the most powerful vote we cast is how we spend our dollars. And so there's a politics of a dollar that has to be in our conversation. That every time I shop at a big box store, I'm sending money out of the community. There's nothing evil about big boxes. But we know that for a community to thrive, the money has to stay close. It has to stay within walking distance. So why don't we educate people about the different levels of politics involved in their dollar vote. And I don't care how few dollars you have, those votes are all equal. And so when the working poor, all right, the way they spend their dollars, they spend them unconsciously. So part of our conversation then is to talk about what conscious economics would look like. Which means that I'm going to spend my dollar locally, in walking distance, and if I have less things, so be it. So that's part of the job, is to get people to change their thinking about the dollar vote. To me, that vote is much more powerful than a ballot box. The other job community has is to produce street life. We've outsourced safety to professionals. There's not a professional in the world that can make me safe. And so you say, well, we're here in this neighborhood, in this walking distance circle of producing street life. And doing it by events is only partially useful. It's day-to-day street life. The other job community has to do is to confront us in our relationship with food. Food and money, we're out of harmony with food and money. Now, in Canada, of course, you're way ahead of us in the U.S. And it's a source of embarrassment and jealousy on my part. Because if I want to learn anything new about caring for community, I have to go to Canada to find out. And then what also makes me jealous is when you do export it, you export it to Seattle and Portland. And so everything innovative about community, most of the projects you hear about, Abundant Community Initiative, you know, and so they've all come from some Canadian source, exported carefully to Portland and Seattle. So food, the relationship with food is a big deal. I have to have food. And so you see, the work is to make food local, to produce it local. The work is to help poor people change their relationship with food, at least in the United States. Because right now, they eat food that won't rot. And so if you want to know how you're sending your dollars out of town, and if you want to know how you're assaulting your own health, every time you eat something that doesn't rot, you're participating in the empire. You're participating. So food is a great lever. So these become the work to do. And you are a response to that. You are a belief that if we build social capital, get people connected, these jobs will get done. We'll raise the children. People will have a right livelihood. They'll have a decent relationship with food. We won't need health care like we do. We will be safe. We will be productive. These are the jobs to do. Now, what's challenging is to make a connection between community building and these jobs, and that's kind of probably the conversation of the week. One other thing that maybe, Paul, I'll stop. There's certain disciplines that require our reimagination. Walter Brueggemann says that the Old Testament story of the Exodus is what we're reenacting now. You coming together is to support each other in claiming our freedom from a colonial or predatory, materialistic, whatever language you want to use. Culture, economic system. We've let the marketplace be the center of culture. You're trying to replace that center of culture into a neighborhood, into a community. Nobody's arguing against capitalism. Nobody's arguing against the marketplace. It's just we've made it so important. We've allowed it to define who we are, to define how I'm doing. Even in our language about poverty, it bothers me. Poverty to me is the absence of possibility. It's not just a question of money. It's an economic or money question. So certain disciplines have to be rethought, and so for the Jews to go to the wilderness and leave the Pharaoh's empire behind, slavery behind, mostly required an active imagination. They couldn't imagine a life other than Pharaoh's existence. Most of us can't imagine a life other than a consumer-based economy. I can't imagine a life where cost and speed and scale aren't the dominant values. So what I have you gathering for this week is to support each other in reimagining the possibility. To do that, then I have to think of an economics of generosity, an economics of abundance. And now we'll be talking later in the week and others about the core economy or the non-monetized economy. Why don't we make that the center of our attention? We also have to deal with the question of faith. And so part of the work, it is a spiritual journey. Paul's a great embodiment of that. Church lost something when he decided to become a man of the world. But say, well, how do we organize the faith community? Because most social movements are financed by the faith community. So I have to reimagine faith as a venture into uncertainty, a venture into emergence. And so architecture matters. You're in this room, you're in this space that Paul and Tamarack had great consciousness about. So I have to create spaces that support our interdependence with each other. I have to get rid of garage door openers. I might even want to get rid of garages, except in Winnipeg. And say, what are those design features of a neighborhood, of a retail store? And you start to have people designing pocket neighborhoods. The alternative in economics is also the cooperative movement. So there's co-housing now. So architecture is a big deal. Art is a big deal. We have to, right now in the U.S., art is out of our school system. We're interested in science, in engineering. So you say, how do we affirm and make grassroots neighborhood art, music, dance? When the Jews left Egypt, I asked Walter once, what was their implementation strategy when they got to the wilderness? What did they do? And he says, oh, their technology was dance. That Miriam danced. And so art's a big. And then journalism was the last thing, and then I'll stop. The work you're coming together for is to shift the narrative of what matters. John represents a radical shift in narrative. Al, Vicky, the people. And so it's a narrative that there is enough, that it has to do with a neighborhood, us coming together, our interdependence, the politics of our vote. And so we need an alternative journalism. Right now in the United States, 5 or 6 organizations control most all the media. So anytime I watch television, newspaper, whatever, and that narrative is the empire narrative. It's a narrative of what went wrong. Even our most liberal journalism papers lead with what's going on, who died last night, who was killed. They have a picture of what's, so part of the work is for you in your places, to say, let's create a narrative of possibility. Create a narrative and create generosity as news. Let's talk what people and neighbors are doing to raise our children productively. What are children, elderly, marginalized people doing? Not what they did, do they need? Not how well cared for are they, but what are they doing? So there's a whole shift in journalism and narrative, what constitutes news. And in Toronto, you have Axiom News. I don't know if Peter's at this conference call.
Peter's here. Where are you, Peter? Hands up.
Stand up, Peter.
Oh, he's coming tomorrow.
Tell me
He's
when
coming
he's
tomorrow, Peter.
What?
He's coming tomorrow.
Oh, okay. When he comes, I want you to give him a standing ovation, all right?
Okay, everybody.
Because he's proving that you can be a financially productive newspaper and journalistic entity talking about what's working in the world. And so all you need is one example to call that evidence. So these are the domains of economics and faith and architecture and art and journalism that I think you're working on. And then we come together to reimagine the wilderness, reimagine an alternative way of being. And so you're gathering neighbors to reimagine what they can do with and for each other. And what you're trying to do is also decommodify labor. So one of the reasons we've let community die is we left the farm our interdependence, where everybody had a job to do. We went to the city for reasons we can talk about if you want. And all of a sudden, when that happened, I went from a citizen and a soul to a wage earner. I became labor. I became commodified. And right now, every time people reduce labor costs, the stock price goes up. So what we're about is decommodifying labor. We're not interchangeable parts. We're not predictable people. And so part of the task of politics, the brilliance and beauty of John and Adam and Paul and all of you, is you're saying, let's find out what people are good at, what they're able to do, and then bring that together. Same thing with the land. We consider the land as a resource to be controlled. Dominance over the land. I went to a zoning meeting once, and the lawyer said that if you can't develop on this land, you've rendered the land useless. And in that statement, we made nature useless if it can't be exploited. We've made the air. So all of these are in play. Last thought is that what you're really saying, what does the work of community do? Or what, if the community was an organizing principle, what would that mean? It would mean that we would reclaim the commons as our own. So for 400 years, 1610 it started, if you want to get specific, with enclosure, that what was common land, which allowed all of us to sustain ourselves, fenced in, got enclosed. The Robin Hood story was a reaction. And so we've been privatizing. Now, more here than in much more of a commons. You have much more faith in your government than we do. I congratulate you for that. But basically, it's the restoration of the commons, I think, in which we talk about abundance, we talk about alternative to a consumer, talk about a communal economy. This becomes it. Everybody's interested in development. You know, you say, well, what happened to our neighborhoods? Well, they got developed. And development is always done in the name of service. So England, you know, developed India. The United States developed Latin America. So anytime anybody uses the word development, I get really nervous. You know, community economic development, because usually it means that I know and you don't. I have assets and you don't. I'm middle class, you're upper middle class, and you're not. And so how can I help you? So the basis of philanthropy in most places is development. But there's a spiritual and an economic and a capacity imbalance in the notion that I will develop you, I will develop. To develop the land is an assault on nature. It's assault on the air, and the wind, and the rain, and the land, and on God. So I just get very wary. But that's what's happened. I've lived into that. I've been working on myself for at least 60 years. And unfortunately, I've been working on the same 4 issues for 60 years. And that tells me that my efforts at self-development have been more an act of violence than an act of consciousness, an act of enlightenment. So for my children, I have been involved in raising 6 children. And my wish and they all turned out the way they turned out. But I spent more time earlier finding out who they were good at, instead of worrying so much about what they needed to become. So there's just a lot that you all are living this, because on the one hand, you have a business perspective funding you, a business perspective, even if it's government or not-for-profit, this perspective of scale and evidence-based and all of this. And on the other hand, you know that you're there to help people discover that everything they thought they needed, they have within them. So that's my over-explaining it. We have to deprofessionalize art. So the work with art, you know, it's not just to have the fine arts trickle down, or the community arts, or the mural arts, it's to discover that each one of us, if I can speak, I can sing. If I can move, I can dance. If I can hold a pencil, I can draw and paint. And so we've the commodification, the wage earner that I've become, as part of what I've learned is you can't sing, you can't dance, you can't draw, you can't write, you can't do poetry. And so the real revolution in art is the democratization of art, is the personalization of art. And that's why I think you're going to end this day with an experience like that with the choir. And it doesn't matter how good you sing, it's just until I've sung, I haven't entered the wilderness, until I've danced. And so thank you for the support on the notion of art. And art will get preference over engineering someday, and then we'll know we've gotten somewhere.
My name is Robert Case, and the thing I found most exciting was the way that you talk about the decommodification of labor and the decommodification of the idea of development, the connection to the commons and that kind of history of struggle against enclosure. I kind of feel that at the community level, that people are responsive to things that are an alternative to the commodification of all things. People are looking for a more tangible, personal, meaningful connection amongst each other and with the goods and services that they use and deliver.
Beautiful statement. What Paul was it?
Rob.
What's a practice that you're engaged in now that gives expression to what you just said, these beliefs?
Well, that's funny you should ask, because we've been supplied with a lot of Nestle bottled water here. I'm involved in an organization in Guelph called the Wellington Water Watchers. We are commoners trying to express our community and our role in stewardship over water. And one of the big battles we have is the Nestle plant in Aberfoyle, just south of Guelph, that supplies all this and packages this water. So I think those sorts of expressions of community around water, education, and sometimes political activity as well.
So, see, I think that building a community will always, those issues are an occasion for community to get built. So it doesn't matter what the issue is.
Yeah.
That's why when John goes around, he says, what do you care about? What are you passionate about? I don't care what you're passionate about. You know, whatever it is, it's an occasion, an excuse. And so you can't say, well, we haven't succeeded unless we've gotten rid of the Nestle plant.
Right.
You say, we're going to use Nestle as an occasion for us to come around with each other. And the ultimate strategy in an abundance world is to stop buying what they produce.
Yeah.
You don't have to chain yourself to the fence because your neighbors are working there.
Right.
So they're not evil. We just want to render them useless. And and then you're not trying to get angry at anybody.
Can I just add that I did some research on water activism in Guelph because I was interested in why people are getting involved. I thought for sure they'd say Nestle's evil, the plastics and everything, and people did say that, but the people who are really involved in activism there, things that come to mind are commodity versus commons. The second major theme is community. I was surprised at how quickly people go from, I'm a water activist because of community. I want to find community, I want to build community, and I feel the breakdown of community is part of why we've lost control over this. It was surprising, and I find it very affirming, I guess I would say.
Beautiful. So there's a book I want to put on the screen. All right? I love this book. That's why I'm holding it up. Our Commonwealth, Barrett Kohler, Jonathan Rowe. And one of the things he says there, Rob, is that until we had the concept of the environmentalists, all the little activities for the animals, for the land, for the sky were separated and not powerful. And so part of what Paul does, and Tamarack does, and John, and all of you do, is to say, well, in this community building, there is a unifying concept that has enough space for everything we care about to be engaged in. And I think the restoration of the commons is also just an idea that Kairos, time has come. Anyway, thank you. Why would I pay twice for water? So the notion that the economic argument is compelling, this blows that up. Because I can get water anywhere I go, and I've already paid once for it. And then the notion I'm going to pay $1 or $2 or $3 for a plastic bottle of water for convenience. And then I always say, and I apologize for this, but some of those bottles had nipples on them. And so I say, what's going on here? And so in some ways, the plastic water bottle with a nipple is an act of surrender. It's a wish to go back to another state. So all of these things, anyone will do. Western Canada has one of the largest, I think the largest water supply in the world.
It does.
And I went to a water supply, they asked me to give a talk on a water conference, which is, I still don't know why they asked me, and that was 5 years ago. But they put a map of water availability and laid on a map of economic success in the match perfect. So it's a huge, huge issue.
It's a huge thing. And I think maybe in one way you could almost define community with the word water.
And each issue, everybody in this room has an issue that they're organized with. They all will take you there. You know, sometimes people get, is it water? Is it, you know, the land? Is it which should we care about most? And my thought in a context of abundance is there's nothing to argue about. And it's like a diamond with a lot of facets. Whichever facet you go through will take you to the same place, which is something that sustains life, that lives into possibility instead of problems. So it's a beautiful statement, Paul.
Hi, Peter. My name's Vicky, and I'm from London, Ontario.
Hi, Vicky.
Thanks for being here.
You're welcome. Thanks for putting up with me.
I've been writing notes furiously on what you've been sharing, but the one thing that stands out for me as a parent, as well as someone who works as a professional with children in the community, the fact that you said personally you wish you had have spent more time finding out who your children were rather than worrying about who they are going to become. And I shared with my lab group this morning that one of the things that stands out for me around the change that needs to happen in community is how children are viewed and how the neighborhood plays a role in that. And I feel like we need to get back to the root and basics of who children are and how they develop, and an understanding that, you know, rather than labeling children as trouble or troubled, to go back to how do we nurture them. And I feel like we've lost the sense of community about how to co-parent as a community, and I wonder if you can just speak to that from your perspective.
I can speak to it, but I can't be any clearer than you are.
Well said.
Right now in California, John and I heard some research once that now we say, how far from home can a child under 7 walk? So that's a measure of our anxiety. Right now it's a block and a half in the U.S., or that part of the U.S. And so, you know, the notion of nurturing the gifts that children are is so different than parenting as a verb. Like I said, I've watched 6 young people grow up, and I've learned nothing. I can see nothing. Some of them from birth, some I picked up at the age of 6 or 8 or 10. But I can see nothing related between the way they were parented and how they turned out. And all those early years, I was worrying, how are these kids going to turn out? Finally, in their 30s, I said, to hell with it. I'm tired of worrying. I declared victory.
Hi, Peter. I'm Scott. I'm from Red Deer.
Hi, Scott.
I just wanted to, I guess, pose a thought that I've been wrestling with, and that's around the concerns around scarcity and abundance. And nowhere do we see it more prevalent than in the funding world. And wrestling with this thought that we're never going to program our way out of or into community, that we need to begin moving some of the resources and enabling and empowering citizens to be citizens and take responsibility and accept responsibility. Yet we're wrapped up in this funding world between those that are receiving funds and don't want to give them up, politicians who don't want to take the hassle or responsibility for the shifting of those responsibilities or resources back into community itself. Just wondering if you might ponder with me on that one.
Of Of course, Al and Mansky and Vicky and that group are just geniuses at this. You know, what came to mind, in addition to agreeing with what you're saying, is that what are the conditions under which distributing money to citizens works? There may be a platform of consciousness that's required. I wouldn't want to hold it as simply a redistribution of wealth. You know, I believe in the democratization of wealth, but it gets complicated. And like one of the projects I'm involved in is a Jubilee Project. And let me mention that now since it came up. And so in the Old Testament, you know, every 7 years, and then a Jubilee year was every 49, we forgave the debts of the poor. And so I'm going to take that seriously for the next few years. And I have no idea what I'm talking about, but I know that in that conversation, we will have a much more nuanced view of what that means. What does it mean to, you know, to forgive the debts of the poor? Which poor? What kind of debts? What are the nature of the debts? You know, to call them a felon, can we get that off there? In the United States, if you're under 21, you can have your record expunged if you're convicted of a felony. Well, why don't we do that for all of us, to welcome people back into community? So I would say that the framing, in a way, is to how do we, in financial terms, welcome people back into community. What you're saying is give them the resources to control their own spending, their own life. But let's do that in a conscious way. Let's do that in a relational way. And having said that, where you started with, you can't raise $1 unless you're looking at an efficiency. That's why the funders are so frustrated. That's why there's such a thing called a grassroots philanthropy group. That's why John and others talk about mini grants, local. We're trying to do something with the money, but it has to be done in the context of building a relationship we want the redistribution to go to. Anyway, thank you. Sorry for the answer to a question you didn't ask.
My name is Matt, and I live a kilometer down the road. I was glad that you mentioned sort of the physical environment. I don't remember quite what you said, but I often think about you don't interact with your neighbors when you get in your car to drive to the big box store versus when you live in a neighborhood where you can walk to the locally owned coffee shop or pub or whatever. You know, and one example that comes to mind for me is I have a tiny backyard, and our house, the front porch is about 5 feet from the sidewalk. And I think some people might say, oh geez, you have no space. But I actually find that, you know, if I had tons of money tomorrow, I wouldn't want a big backyard because then I would never see my neighbors. Anyway, that's my long preamble to sort of say, can you comment more on sort of how cities should physically develop so that it facilitates community building better? Does that question make sense?
Well, there's all kinds of things going on. Like I said, there's something called pocket neighborhoods. Who I apologize for, but he wrote a book about that, and he says nobody wants to be close to the street all the time, and nobody wants to be alone all the time. And so you start designing things where people could choose the distance. So you have a front door as a threshold, and then you have a front porch as another level threshold with a little railing on it. Then you have a front yard, and then you have a sidewalk, and then you have a parking, and then you have the street. So you say our whole idea in physical design is to make people visible and accessible to each other. And so you have a whole co-housing movement where people are building or buying a neighborhood together, 17, 15, 30 families, with a commons. And maybe there's a house where they can cook dinner one night. Once a month I help cooking dinner, or I can eat alone. So the built environment is decisive. It even gets into rooms. A room without a window renders nature obsolete. Now, I don't know if this conference room you're in has any windows. I hope that it does. But a lot of conference centers don't have windows. And you say, well, why don't you put a window in here? Well, we don't want people to be distracted by nature. I say, well, why don't you deal with the question of interesting content? rather than forcing them. And so, in room design, even the tables, why do we have to sit at tables? You know, maybe we should be in a, you look at the design of a chair, how about chairs with wheels, so that I walk in the room and know I can move among many groups and make that easy because I have some kind of mobility with the wheels. So at the level of a room, of a building, in the US, the top 10 winning designs for architecture, nobody wants to inhabit those places. It's a design. So you can take it at any level you want. For a city, for urban planning, it's all about the commons. It's all about a square, and it's all about locating not just the coffee shop, but also a hardware store, and a place to clean, and a place to get clothing, a place for food. Cities are growing food, I'm sure, in each of your cities. You got all kinds of community gardens and community-supported agriculture. So all those become out, and the new urbanism, is leaning in that direction.
David Derbyshire from Hamilton, Ontario. And my question, Peter, is how do we open up the space for the people that are most affected by decision making to be part of that decision making?
Right. So that question, what you're intending to do, just keep asking that question. There's no answer to it. One other quick thought is that stop using the word input. Nothing is more colonizing than asking people for their input. And that to me is a kind of a placebo strategy. So the notion, we want input from citizens. As soon as I hear that, I know that they won't do what you're intending to do with your question. Thank you.
Hi, my name is Erin Harvey. I'm from Guelph, and I just the title of this session is "Community Has a Job to Do." John McKnight talked about the connection between democracy and community, and one of the things he talked about this morning is the we all do our, and you mentioned it just now, Peter, that we just do what we're passionate about, and Peter or John talked about something will ignite and it will become a bigger movement, and that really for democracy to take hold we need to be moving into sort of these bigger movements. I'm just wondering if you have any predictions about what the next movement might be, and whether, certainly people seem fired up about the Northern Gateway pipeline that's just been approved by the Canadian government, and also the recent Ontario election, if that might be any indicator about people are tired of austerity, and that in a time when we have more wealth than ever before, and governments all over the world, developed governments anyways, are talking about austerity. If things like what's happened in Ontario, and what's going to be the thing that ignites next? Any predictions?
Well, I could make an observation, and that let me say just for this moment that movement is underway. We just have to name it. We just have to make it visible. There's nothing to wait for. And to me, it has many names: local, living, cooperative, sustainable. The movement's underway. We just don't call it news.
Hello, Peter. I'm Linda Boyd from Red Deer. I have a question for you just around how community plays out with complexity. More and more, when we go back to the water analogy, discussion in our community has been fluoridating water. Well, it's not a collective impact kind of question. You have to know a lot of details to know which side of the argument to chew on, and the pipeline that we just mentioned is even more so. So when you think about community empowering in really somewhat multifaceted, complex issues, what's the balance look like? How does that work together?
Great question. And if I had an answer to that, you will be the first to know. What concerns me, one thing, Paul, what can we organize against? I don't have much faith that the movement will be against something. And I also know that it's a movement with a lot of faces. It's like a hero with 1,000, it's a movement with 1,000 faces. And so if you want to get engaged in the pipeline, whatever resonates with you, if it's water, if it's a pipeline, if it's a neighborhood, if it's architecture, if it's art. These are all the same conversation. And I need to create a kind of connection to learn what you just said. You know, these are complicated issues. Well, I need to be in dialogue with serious people about what's going on here. And it's the act of being in dialogue. If I care about poverty, I need to be in a conversation with people who are working poor. I don't need to have an answer to the working poor. And I think I have to honor the complexity, which is what you started with. It was a beautiful statement.
Yes, hello Peter, my name is Larry Gemmel, j'habite Valemont de Quebec. I'm going to be honest with you. I find your ideas in writing to be quite difficult and challenging, and I think that's because in most of my career, as a manager and a fundraiser of nonprofit organizations that were pretty closely coupled to the capitalist system, I probably am uncomfortable with some of the things you're saying.
Thank you.
And I knew you were going to take that as a compliment.
No, that's gratitude for your giving voice to this.
Yeah. Well, and so I'm very interested in exploring this, and particularly I'm interested in, okay, so I get the idea that we need to change the narrative, and I'm on side with that. But do you have any more specific advice for people that are engaged in the system? They're, as you and John and others have said, they're good people for the most part, but they are engaged deeply in the system that is quite distorting. And I'm interested in not only the general ideas of changing the narrative, but maybe more specifically how we can make connections for people who are in positions of power and influence, but are perhaps part of the problem.
You'll never hear me argue against people in these positions. You'll never hear me arguing the notion that we need better leadership or different leadership. I'll never argue against capitalism. Everyone in this conversation today is deeply embedded in capitalism. So to me, that conversation doesn't take us anywhere. The people running foundations or the CEOs, everybody loves to talk about the financial community in this country. I don't participate in that conversation because I'm with you. So the question is, who can we get in the room together that aren't used to talking to each other and be as honest with each other as you were just with me? I write books about things I don't understand. Why would you waste time on something you did understand? And so all the infinitely more complicated than a page can represent. And John, among other things, has opened the notion of hospitality, the welcoming of strangers. The only conversation I want to be in is with people I'm, with having conversations I'm not used to talking about. And so they're not advocacy, it's not an argument, it's not a debate, it's not a hearing. That's what you have. That gets very practical. You could ask yourself, you're interested enough to be in the room to say something to me. So that's what I'm grateful for. And you say, well, who could you gather on the difficulty of these issues into a long-term conversation about what's at stake and how do we deepen our understanding and our connection with each other? And that's why, Paul had you together for 5 days, because he knows that. I just read, Walter Brueggemann with John, been such an important conversation partners. So here's a quote from Walter. The alternative to the kingdom of scarcity is the practice of neighborhood. It is a covenantal commitment to the common good. That alternative is not easy or obvious or automatic. It requires a departure, an intentional departure. Okay, and it's a departure from this empire world. And so to me, the other thing that's interesting about that sacred text is that when the Jews got to the wilderness, the first thing they wanted to do is to go back. They bitched and moaned about Pharaoh for a long, long time, and finally they get their freedom. They get manna from heaven, and then they have a meeting and say, I kind of liked Egypt. That's why there's nobody to point to. And so they recreated they recreated Solomon, they recreated empire. They're doing it now. So that's one thought. The other is there's some things, I think, that define the movement. So one element of the movement is the whole cooperative movement. And to say that businesses can exist for something more than profit. And so that's happening everywhere. How do we connect people, neighborhood people, with capital and with resources? I want to understand the landscape of poverty. I want to know who's producing something in a poor neighborhood, if that's my concern, and say, how do we amplify what they've already started to produce? I don't have to do job training. I don't have to educate them. I don't have to send them back to school. I don't have to teach them how to do a business plan. I just say, who is already producing something? And some people know how to pray, and some people can watch children. How do we help make an economic unit out of that? And then how do we make that visible? See, I think there is a cooperative living economic. It's just we haven't decided to name it fully. We still treat it as an exception. Second practical thing is there are structures designed to do what you're doing, and you'll hear about them this week. There's time banking, which gives me a local measure of generosity. And the most radical thing about time banking is that it says that everybody's hour has equal value. So if you want to decommodify labor, you start by saying a surgeon, a doctor, a car mechanic, and somebody who watches children, an hour of each of their time has equal economic value. So let's track that. There's slow money movements. There's a rental partnership, rental equity in Cincinnati, where there's maybe 80 or 90 units where people working poor live there, and if they take care of the unit and go to meetings once a week, at the end of 4 years, they're given $4,000 into a bank account. So it's wealth creation for the working poor. This is a generous structure. And so you say, well, some of us are good at that. How do we create generous structures? I mentioned the Jubilee. Why don't we take it seriously and reimagine the forgiveness of debt? Mark Danielski, who's a native son of Canada, who many of you probably know or know about, he wrote a book called The Economics of Happiness. Brilliant. And he says that the economic burden on the province or the country is its interest payments. And so we need to confront that. So let's start a conversation about forgiving debt. Most debt is based on interest, not on what I borrow from. And then there's a learning process. So the notion of book circles, video circles, people getting together on a regular basis every 2 weeks and say, what can we learn? Let's read this book, Our Commonwealth. Let's read Sam and Nika. There's all kinds of writing out there that has named this movement, has answered the question, what would it be like if community was the organizing principle? And so all of those. And then I know that the small group is the unit of transformation. That 6, 7 people sitting around the table talking about what they care about changes the world. See, we've lost part of the business perspective, the empire perspective, is the love of scale. So part of the conversation about the people with funds and funding is, can they imagine funding things that you can't take to scale? Scale is the commodification of invention. Every time you take something that works here and try to spread it, you will suck the life out of it. I promise you that, because then you'll find sponsors, you'll end up selling it in different places, you'll have to do training, and people will have to go to workshops. And so scale is decisive. There's a guy who wrote a book that says the problem with violence in the world is due to scale. We've combined things that don't fit together. He says that when the United States fought the Civil War, we should have let the South go. So the notion of scale, small. The notion of speed, slow. The notion of cost, we replace with relationship. How do we get connected? And not connected in a festival, not connected randomly, but connected around purpose, around passion, around something people care about. And I'll take what it, now there's some limits to that, of course. So this becomes the movement. And I think, what I think is brilliant about what Paul does and Tamarack does is they understand these things and they organize you that way. You know, you'll put up with these plenary sessions, but we all know that the real work will be in small groups, especially if the small groups are organized around hospitality, which is the welcoming of strangers. Like-mindedness kills community. Like-mindedness says, I'm only going to be with the people who think like me, who share my vision, share my this or that. So the alternative is to say, well, I need people who care about the same thing, but I want 100 different ways of thinking about that. And the final thing is that when we bring people together in neighborhoods, you don't want people to be helpful to each other. Help, as I said earlier, is a colonizing activity. It means that I know and you don't. And so what you do is you substitute curiosity for advice. So these are plebeian or communal protocols. So every time we come together, I always tell people, for this gathering, don't be helpful to each other. Don't tell me that when you were my age, here's what you did, because it implies that it worked out. Most cases, it didn't work out. You know, I'm not a role model. Anybody who stands in front of us and says, look, I did this and it worked out, is only seen half the world. So you say, let's just get curious. The most loving question in the world is the question, why does that matter to you? And thank you, Paul. Thank you all.
Hey everyone, Peter Block.
Okay, thank you.